Good evening, my friends. I'm Dr. John H. Watson. Settle into your chair and draw close to the fire, for tonight I must relate a tale of murder that defies the very laws of reason, a case where a dead man received a message sealed in the future. Before we begin our journey into the London fog, I ask you to indulge an old soldier. Tell me, which city are you listening from tonight? And what is your favourite Sherlock Holmes story among the many I have chronicled? I always enjoy hearing from you, whether you are seated by your own hearth or listening to our adventures on Spotify. Now, let us turn the clock back to a stifling Monday in the summer of our late Queen's Diamond Jubilee. The air inside our sitting room at Baker Street was thick and stagnant, carrying the faint, metallic odour of the carbolic soap I had just used to scrub my hands. I sat at the central table, meticulously organising my medical satchel. It is a habit born of my days in the Afghan campaign, a necessary ritual of imposing order upon the tools of my trade before the chaos of the world requires them. I checked the brass clasps of the leather bag, enjoying the smooth, worn texture beneath my thumbs. Beside it, I arranged fresh rolls of white lint, tightly stoppered glass vials of iodine and morphine, and my surgical instruments, their steel edges gleaming dully in the gaslight. There is a profound comfort in the predictability of medicine. A severed artery will always spurt. A pupil exposed to belladonna will always dilate. Cause and effect march in a reliable, orderly procession. Crime, I had learned during my tenure with Sherlock Holmes, rarely affords such simple geometry. Outside our window, the streets of London were choked with a feverish anticipation. Bunting in red, white and blue festooned the lampposts, and the distant, ceaseless clatter of hansom cabs spoke of a city swelling with foreign dignitaries and loyal subjects. Tomorrow was the 22nd of June, the official day of the Queen's Jubilee procession. Yet within our rooms, all was quiet. Holmes stood by the mantelpiece, silent and completely still, enveloped in a grey cloud of shank tobacco. He had been staring at the empty grate for the better part of an hour, his sharp profile resembling a hunting bird entirely devoid of prey. The silence shattered with a violent, erratic clatter upon the stairs. These were not the measured steps of a scheduled client, nor the heavy boots of a Scotland Yard inspector. The footfalls were frantic, stumbling, driven by an engine of sheer panic. I heard Mrs. Hudson issue a sharp cry of protest from the landing, but her voice was immediately swept aside as our door burst inward, striking the wall with a report like a pistol shot. A young woman stood in the threshold. She gripped the door frame with bloodless fingers, swaying slightly, as if the solid wood was the only structure preventing her collapse. My medical training engaged before my conscious thought. I noted the severe cyanosis around her lips, a blue tint that spoke of perilous oxygen deprivation. Her breathing was shallow and painfully rapid. The erratic flutter of the lace at her throat betrayed a racing, thready pulse. Her pupils were blown wide, consuming the irises entirely, transforming her eyes into dark pools of pure terror. This was not the polite distress of a lady who had misplaced a valuable heirloom. This was the profound physiological shock of a human being who had looked directly into the abyss. I rose immediately, stepping around the table to offer my arm, but Holmes was already moving. He crossed the room with that sudden, deceptive speed of his, guiding the young woman into the armchair beside the hearth. He did not offer empty platitudes. He did not tell her everything would be well. Instead, he poured a small measure of brandy from the sideboard and pressed the glass into her trembling hands. "Drink this, Miss Pendleton," Holmes said, his voice entirely devoid of inflection. "The shock of the morning has drained the blood from your brain. You will find the spirit a temporary but necessary restorative." She looked up at him, her dark eyes flashing with sudden bewilderment. "How do you know my name?" she whispered, her voice raspy and entirely stripped of breath. "You wear a mourning ring bearing the crest of the Pendleton family." "A rather distinct boar and thistle," Holmes replied smoothly. "The ring is slightly too large for your finger, suggesting it belonged to your late mother. Furthermore, the monogram on your reticule confirms the initial P-pen. Now, breathe deeply. You have run a considerable distance from the cab stand at the corner, and the heavy wool of your travelling cloak is entirely unsuited for this oppressive June heat." The young woman swallowed the brandy. A faint trace of colour returned to her cheeks, though the violent tremor in her hands remained. I stood back, observing the mud splashed high upon the hem of her skirts. It was a yellowish clay, completely unlike the dark grime of the Baker Street pavement. "My father is dead," she said. The words fell from her mouth like stones. There were no tears. The horror was too fresh, too absolute to allow for the release of weeping. Holmes leaned back against the mantelpiece, steepling his long pale fingers beneath his chin. "I surmised as much," he said quietly. "You possess the posture of someone who has suffered a sudden, violent loss. You did not come here to prevent a tragedy, Miss Pendleton. You came because the tragedy has already occurred. When did you find him?" "An hour ago," she answered, her gaze fixed upon the empty fireplace. "I had gone to the country for the weekend to avoid the crowds gathering for the Jubilee. Father insisted I go. He said he had important correspondence to manage and required absolute silence in the house. I returned this morning to our residence in Kensington. The front door was unlocked. The servants had been given the week off to celebrate the holiday. I called out to him. There was no answer. She stopped, her chest heaving as she struggled to draw air. I stepped forward and placed a calming hand upon her shoulder, feeling the rigid tension in her muscles. "Take your time, madam," I murmured. "I found him in his study," she continued, her voice dropping to a hollow whisper. He was slumped over his mahogany desk. There was blood, so much blood, on the leather blotter. The window facing the garden was wide open, the curtains blowing in the hot breeze. I touched his shoulder. He was cold. He must have been dead for hours. I knew I should run for the police. I knew I should scream for the neighbours. But then I saw his hand. What of his hand? What of his hand? Holmes asked, his eyes narrowing imperceptibly. It was clenched tight, resting near the edge of the desk, she said, leaning forward as if sharing a terrible secret. I pried his fingers open. I do not know why I did it. Some terrible instinct compelled me. He was holding something. I took it, put it in my pocket, and then I ran out into the street to find a constable. The police are there now. Inspector Lestrade is examining the room, but I did not give him what I found. I came straight to you. "Why did you withhold evidence from Scotland Yard?" I asked, unable to keep the surprise from my voice. "Because the police will look for a common thief," she said, looking directly at me, "and a common thief did not do this. My father was a quiet man, an archivist for the Royal Historical Society. He had no enemies, but for the past week he has been terrified. He jumped at shadows. He locked the doors twice, and then I found this in his lifeless hand." Miss Pendleton reached into the pocket of her heavy cloak. Her hand emerged clutching a square of heavy cream-coloured parchment. She held it out to Holmes. Holmes did not take it immediately. He stood looking at the object with the intense, calculating gaze of a botanist discovering a deadly new species of flora. Then, with a fluid motion, he plucked the letter from her fingers. I watched him as he carried the parchment toward the window, catching the harsh daylight. It was an envelope, completely blank on the front. There was no name, no address, no postage stamp. The paper was unusually thick, the sort of expensive vellum reserved for high government correspondence or ancient legal deeds. Holmes brought the envelope to his face, closing his eyes as he inhaled the scent of the paper. He turned it over. On the reverse side rested a heavy seal of deep crimson wax. It was entirely unbroken. "Fascinating," Holmes murmured. "The envelope is empty, Watson." I frowned, moving to stand beside him. "Empty," I repeated. "Are you certain?" Holmes pinched the edges of the thick vellum between his thumb and forefinger. "There is no weight to it. The paper yields perfectly to pressure. A man is murdered in his study, clutching a blank, empty envelope. And yet he gripped it with such desperate force that rigor mortis preserved his hold. The absence of a letter is the very reason this object matters." He retrieved his silver magnifying lens from his waistcoat pocket and bent closely over the crimson wax. He remained in that posture for a long time, the silence stretching taut across the room. I could hear the erratic, shallow breaths of Miss Pendleton from the armchair. I could hear the dull roar of the London crowd celebrating in the distance. But from Holmes, there was nothing but the steady, calculating stillness of a mind at work. When he finally straightened, his grey eyes were entirely cold. He walked back to the centre of the room and looked down at the young woman. "Miss Pendleton," Holmes said, his voice dropping to a low, precise register. "You are certain your father died some time during the night?" "Yes," she whispered, shrinking back slightly from the intensity of his gaze. "The doctor who arrived with the police said he had been dead for at least 12 hours. He must have been murdered late last evening." "Why do you ask?" Holmes held the blank envelope out, the crimson seal catching the light of the gas lamp. "Because, Miss Pendleton, the wax used to seal this envelope bears a highly specific crest. It is the official commemorative stamp of the Royal Mint, struck exclusively for the diplomatic parcels of the Queen's Jubilee. I failed to see the impossible nature of that, I interjected, looking from the wax to my friend. The Jubilee is upon us. Holmes turned to me, his expression perfectly grave. The Jubilee is tomorrow, Watson. The Royal Mint does not release this stamp to the diplomatic corps until midnight tonight. Your father, Miss Pendleton, was murdered by a man who sealed this empty envelope with tomorrow's wax. Chapter 2. The Dead Man's Desk. We arrived at the Kensington address of the late Sir Reginald Sterling, just as a miserable grey dawn broke over the city. The rain had ceased, leaving behind a damp chill that seeped through the heavy wool of my ulster. A young constable, shivering by the wrought iron gate, admitted us without a word, his face pale and drawn tight against his skull. As a medical man, I immediately noted the faint, uncontrollable tremor in his hands and his heavily dilated pupils. These were the universal, involuntary signs of a man whose nervous system had been profoundly unsettled by shock. We bypassed the weeping servants huddled in the lower parlour and climbed the sweeping mahogany staircase. The air grew perceptibly colder as we approached the second floor. When Holmes pushed open the heavy oak doors to the study, the first thing that struck me was the silence. For a man reputed to possess one of the finest collections of antique timepieces in London, the absolute absence of ticking was as deafening as a cannon blast. The body of the archivist had already been removed to the mortuary by the yardmen, but his violent end was inscribed upon the room with grim clarity. A dark, gelatinous pool of coagulated blood stained the centre of the Persian rug. Its coppery odour mixed unpleasantly with the scent of stale tobacco, lemon oil, and the faint tang of ozone. I knelt by the stain, keeping the hem of my coat clear of the ruin, and ran a gloved finger near its outer edge. The blood had separated, the serum drying in a pale halo around the darker mass. Given the ambient temperature of the room and the state of coagulation, I judged the time of death to be between 6 and 8 hours prior, placing the murder shortly before midnight. Furthermore, a spray of arterial cast-off on the lower wainscoting suggested a single, devastating wound to the carotid. It was an execution of terrifying efficiency. Holmes, however, paid the floor no mind. His attention was entirely captured by the towering bookshelves and the heavy walnut desk situated beneath the tall, mullioned windows. He moved through the room with that peculiar, silent agility of his, like a hound catching the first elusive thread of a scent. He did not touch anything. He merely stood in the centre of the study, his sharp grey eyes cataloguing every inkwell, every scattered paper, every shifting shadow. I watched his posture closely. The usual languid droop of his shoulders, so prominent during our idle days at Baker Street, was entirely gone. In its place was a rigid, electric tension. He was entirely absorbed in the space, reading the invisible currents of the struggle that had taken place. I conducted my own survey from the doorway. The struggle, if there had indeed been one, was strangely localized. The heavy velvet curtains were undisturbed. The glass of the delicate display cabinets remained intact, yet the dead man's desk was in a state of chaotic ruin. A heavy brass reading lamp lay shattered, its reservoir cracked, and its oil pooling darkly into the grain of the wood. A leather-bound ledger was torn nearly in half. The thick stitching snapped with brutal force. And then there were the clocks. I stepped closer to a magnificent French carriage clock resting on the marble mantelpiece. Its brass casing was cold to the touch. The ornate hands were frozen at precisely 11 minutes past 4. I moved to the adjacent wall, where a grand Vienna regulator hung in a glass and mahogany case. It too stood completely still, the heavy brass pendulum arrested in its arc, the hands pointing to 11 minutes past 4. A sense of deep, creeping unease began to settle over my spirit. I turned back to the ruined desk, where a small silver pocket clock lay upon its side near the spilled oil. I righted it with careful fingers. The hands displayed 11 minutes past 4. I drew my companion's attention to this impossible synchronization. I stated my medical opinion that the murderer must have experienced a psychotic break following the savagery of the killing, taking the time to stop every clock in the room in a bizarre ritual that suggested a mind entirely unhinged from reality. Holmes crouched beside the desk, a large brass magnifying glass already in his hand. He did not look up as he replied. He stated that a madman acts without purpose, but there was a terrifying mathematical precision to the violence in this room. He instructed me to examine the mainsprings of the mechanisms. I opened the casing of the carriage clock on the mantel. The spring was tightly coiled, resisting my touch. The clock was fully wound. I checked the grand regulator on the wall. The heavy brass weights were pulled to their highest possible position. The mechanisms had not run down naturally over time. They had been deliberately and forcefully halted. Holmes rose from his crouch and walked to the far side of the desk, his attention now fixed upon a small, unremarkable detail that my own eyes had entirely glossed over in the gloom. He beckoned me forward with a sharp wave of his hand. Beside the shattered brass lamp, half concealed by a crumpled sheet of blue blotting paper, lay a single, hardened drop of wax. It was no larger than a shilling piece, yet its colour was startlingly vivid against the dark walnut. It was not the dull brick red of standard postal sealing wax used by the millions in London every day. It was a luminous, unnatural crimson, resembling a fresh drop of arterial blood. I leaned in closely, bringing my face within inches of the desk. The smell emanating from the tiny droplet was sharp, catching violently in the back of my throat. It possessed an acrid chemical tang, utterly devoid of the usual organic scent of melting pine rosin, shellac, or beeswax. Holmes produced a small silver penknife from his waistcoat pocket and gently pried the crimson droplet from the polished surface. He held it up to the grey light filtering through the mullioned window, turning it slowly between his long, pale fingers. He noted its brittle texture aloud, remarking upon its glassy sheen and lack of natural porousness. With his free hand, he struck a Vesta match and held the flickering flame exactly 1 inch below the wax. The chemical reaction was instantaneous and entirely unnatural. The wax did not soften, weep, or melt into a malleable puddle as any ordinary resin would. Instead, it hissed sharply, emitting a thin wisp of pale green smoke, and then shattered into a dozen microscopic crystalline fragments upon his palm. I recoiled instantly, coughing into my fist as the foul-smelling vapour hit my nostrils. It was like breathing in the concentrated fumes of a cholera ward, a sickly sweet decay mixed with raw sulphur and burning copper. I warned Holmes sharply that the substance was highly toxic, likely containing a heavy concentration of arsenic or antimony, and urged him to dispose of it. Holmes calmly swept the crystalline fragments into a small glass vial from his pocket, corking it tightly with a look of profound satisfaction. He stated that it was neither arsenic nor antimony. He explained that ordinary sealing wax is a simple ancient compound, easily melted and easily broken. This substance, however, was a complex synthetic polymer. He pointed out the distinct green smoke, the crystalline fracture pattern under heat, and the sheer resistance to a direct open flame. He declared it to be a highly specialized industrial sealant, a compound explicitly designed to withstand immense physical pressure and extreme thermal conditions. He concluded with absolute certainty that it was a chemical formula not yet available to the commercial public, an experimental compound born of a highly advanced laboratory. I stood amidst the frozen timepieces, a profound chill settling into my bones that had nothing to do with the damp morning air. In all my years of military service in Afghanistan and my subsequent medical practice in London, I had seen the myriad ways men choose to destroy one another. I had treated the victims of crimes of passion, crimes of desperate greed, and the brutal, senseless violence of the rookeries, but this mahogany room spoke of an entirely different breed of malice. There was a sickening clinical detachment to it all. The murderer had butchered Sir Reginald, leaving a copious amount of lifeblood on the rug, and then, with calm, steady hands, had moved methodically about the room, carefully applying a toxic, experimental wax to the intricate gears of multiple clocks. The juxtaposition of savage violence and meticulous, microscopic sabotage was staggering to the rational mind. I asked Holmes how a common murderer came to possess an experimental industrial sealant and why he would waste such a rare substance in a private study in Kensington. Holmes walked to the window, staring out at the rain-slicked streets below where the carriages were beginning to roll past. He replied that the wax was not used merely to seal a letter, but to seal a mechanism. He pointed back to the silver pocket-torque resting near the spilled oil. He instructed me to examine the casing once more, to look closely at the microscopic hinges beneath the glass face. I retrieved the silver clock and brought it to the light of the window. There, pressed deep into the microscopic crevice of the brass hinge, invisible to the naked eye without intense scrutiny, was a tiny smear of that same luminous crimson substance. It had been used to jam the delicate wheelwork, applied with the steady precision of a master watchmaker. I immediately checked the carriage clock on the mantelpiece. I found another microscopic smear of crimson wax wedged into the escapement gear. The murderer had not simply stopped the clocks. He had permanently cemented them at 11 minutes past 4. Holmes turned from the window, his eyes alight with the cold, fierce thrill of the chase. He stated that the peculiar nature of a criminal is almost always his eventual undoing. A man who murders with a common kitchen knife is one of a million nameless souls in this sprawling city. A man who murders and then employs a bespoke chemical polymer to permanently halt time is a singular identifiable entity. He informed me that there were perhaps 10 men in all of the British Empire capable of synthesizing a compound with these exact thermal and tensile properties. 7 of them worked directly for the Crown at the Woolwich Arsenal, producing experimental ordnance sealants for the Royal Navy. 2 were in private employment in the heavy iron shipyards of the industrial north, but only 1 operated a private laboratory here in London, a man who had recently published a highly controversial paper on thermal-resistant synthetic resins in a chemical society journal. I asked Holmes for the name of this particular chemist. He replied that his name was Elias Vance, a brilliant but disgraced academic who had been expelled from his university post and now maintained a grim little workshop in the perpetual shadow of the Shadwell Basin. Holmes was already moving toward the door, his Inverness cape billowing behind him, declaring that the game was afoot and we must pay Mr. Vance a visit before the trail grew cold. As I gathered my medical bag to follow him out into the gloomy corridor, I cast one final glance around the ruined study. I remarked to Holmes that the sequence of events still baffled my medical and logical understanding. A man bleeds to death on the floor, yet the struggle at the desk suggests a frantic search, culminating in the bizarre, permanent sabotage of the timepieces. I asked him what prize could possibly warrant such an elaborate and macabre theatrical display in the dead of night. Holmes paused at the threshold, his hand resting lightly upon the heavy brass doorknob. His voice, when he finally spoke, was dangerously quiet, carrying a weight that made the hair on my arms stand on end. He corrected my fundamental assumption. He said there was no search. A search implies a frantic hunting for the unknown, a tossing of drawers and a scattering of irrelevant papers. The destruction on the dead man's desk was singular and precise. The torn ledger, the shattered lamp, the careful application of the crimson wax, these were not the desperate acts of a man looking for something hidden. They were the deliberate acts of a man concealing something newly created. He raised a long finger and directed my attention back to the torn spine of the leather ledger. I walked back to the desk and examined the heavy binding one last time. The pages had been ripped out with immense, tearing force, but a jagged sliver of the final page remained trapped tightly in the heavy linen stitching. I leaned close to read the date inscribed in Sir Reginald's meticulous copperplate handwriting upon that ruined fragment. It was not a record of the past, nor an entry for the day of his murder. It was dated for the following day. Holmes stood rigidly in the doorway, his tall silhouette framed by the encroaching shadows of the unlit hall. He stated flatly that Sir Reginald was writing a correspondence dated for a day he would never live to see. The murder interrupted him, ended his life, took the freshly written letter, and sealed it upon this very desk, using a chemical compound designed to survive the intense heat of an industrial furnace and the crushing depths of the ocean. Holmes stepped backward into the gloom, leaving me alone for a fleeting second with the silent, frozen clocks. He asked me to consider as we made for the Shadwell docks, what sort of terrible truth requires a seal of tomorrow's wax, and what inescapable inferno the murderer intends to send it through. Chapter 3. The Statnus Cret. The fog had thickened into a yellowish soup by the time our hansom cab discharged us at the mouth of a nameless court off Fleet Street. Rolling off the unseen Thames in greasy sulphurous waves, the miasma choked the gas lamps down to mere pinpricks of weak, jaundiced light. The damp chill of the November afternoon penetrated my heavy wool overcoat, carrying with it the unmistakable stench of river mud, intermingled with the sharp bite of raw coal smoke. Holmes led the way without a moment of hesitation. His stride was purposeful, his ulster coat flapping behind him as he navigated the slick, uneven cobblestones. In his right pocket rested the anomalous fragment of crimson wax, the singular clue that had drawn us into this bleak labyrinth of the city. Muffled hoofbeats and the distant cries of street vendors provided a dreary symphony to our march. But my companion remained entirely silent, his mind entirely consumed by the puzzle at hand. The establishment we sought was tucked between a shuttered public house and a crumbling, soot-stained warehouse. Its narrow window was so crusted with earth and grime that the glow from within struggled to project more than a sickly aura onto the damp pavement. Above the door, a faded wooden sign hung by a single rusted iron hook, thrown in faintly in the sluggish breeze. It read Josiah Penhaligon, stationer and bookbinder. When I pushed the heavy oak door inward, a brass bell above our heads announced our arrival, with a dull, cheerless clank. The interior of the shop was a claustrophobic cavern of commerce. Floor-to-ceiling shelves groaned under the weight of thick ledgers, reams of heavy parchment, stacks of foolscap, and regimented rows of glass inkwells. The air was suffocatingly dry and profoundly stagnant, redolent of decaying leather, animal glue, and the metallic tang of iron gall ink. It was an environment that seemed perfectly calculated to preserve paper and slowly mummify men. The man standing behind the scarred mahogany counter appeared well on his way to such a desolate fate. Josiah Penhaligon was a creature constructed of the very shadows he inhabited. My medical eye immediately catalogued the physical symptoms of chronic distress and acute terror. His posture was severely kyphotic, his narrow shoulders hunched up toward his ears, as if anticipating a physical blow. His complexion was the color of spoiled milk, a waxy pallor that contrasted sharply with the dark, bruised rings beneath his protruding eyes. Most telling, however, were his hands. They rested flat upon the counter, the knuckles entirely white, yet a fine, rapid tremor vibrated through his fingers, ratting a small pen nib against the wood. His breathing was rapid and shallow, barely lifting the fabric of his threadbare waistcoat. This was not a man surprised by the entrance of unexpected customers. This was a man who had been waiting for the executioner. Holmes approached the counter in absolute silence. He did not introduce himself. He did not offer a pleasantry. He reached into his coat pocket, retrieved the piece of crimson wax, and placed it upon the scratched mahogany with a sharp click. Penhaligon stared at the fragment. A sudden bead of perspiration broke out upon his upper lip, gleaming in the weak gaslight despite the freezing temperature of the shop. His pupil dilation was immediate and profound, turning his pale irises almost entirely black. "You recognize the formulation," Holmes said. It was not a question. The tone was completely flat, a statement of absolute, inescapable fact. The stationer tried to speak, but his vocal cords seemed paralyzed by the dry air and his own fright. He cleared his throat, producing a dry, rasping sound. "I sell many waxes, sir. Red wax is common. Cinnabar red is common," Holmes replied, leaning fractionally closer. "Vermilion is common. This specific shade is not. It is achieved through the introduction of a remarkably specific chromium salt, mixed with a highly refined grade of shellac imported directly from the Indian subcontinent. It requires a kiln temperature precisely calibrated, a method exclusively patented by a single artisan in the whole of London." "You." Penhaligon dragged a trembling hand across his mouth. The tremor had spread from his fingers to his jaw. "I sold the last of that batch months ago. I cannot remember to whom. Cash transactions leave no ledgers." Holmes rested his hands flat on the counter, perfectly mirroring the terrified stationer, yet projecting an overwhelming aura of command. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "You sold it months ago, yet the fragment upon this counter retains the microscopic volatile oils of a seal poured less than 24 hours past. You did not sell it. You supplied it. To whom did you supply it, Penhaligon?" The man closed his eyes. The breath rattled visibly in his chest, his pulse visibly beating against the thin skin of his neck. "You do not understand. If I speak his name, the wax will be from my own coffin." Before Holmes could dissect this admission, a sound shattered the heavy silence of the shop. It was not a loud noise, merely the muffled scrape of a boot heel against unfinished wood, followed by the faint rustle of heavy fabric. The sound originated from the gloom directly behind the counter, where a curtain of faded green velvet concealed what I presumed to be a stockroom or private living quarters. Penhaligon gasped. He threw himself backward against the shelving with such force that a bottle of ink toppled and shattered on the floorboards. He raised his hands defensively, his face contorted into a mask of absolute paralyzing dread. Holmes reacted with the swiftness of a striking serpent, leaping onto the counter to vault over it. But the hidden eavesdropper was already in violent motion. The velvet curtain was torn aside with brutal force. The gaslight briefly illuminated a tall, powerfully built figure, cloaked in a heavy Inverness cape, the collar turned up high and a slouched hat pulled low, entirely obscuring the facial features in shadow. I did not wait for an invitation to act. My medical practice had softened my hands, but my service in Afghanistan had left me with a permanent ache in my shoulder and reflexes that remained remarkably sharp. As the figure surged past the edge of the counter toward the shop door, I lunged forward to intercept him, dropping my center of gravity. My hands found purchase on rough, heavy wool. The man possessed shocking physical power. The momentum of his desperate flight carried us both crashing into a precarious display of stacked ledgers and unbound folios. We went down in a chaotic, blinding avalanche of heavy paper and thick cardboard bindings. In the closeness of the struggle, I caught the distinct scent of the man. It was an unnatural, metallic odor, much like the smell of ozone in the air immediately following a lightning strike, undercut by the damp organic rot of the riverbanks. "Hold him, Watson," Holmes shouted, dropping into the fray and reaching for the man's flailing arms. I shifted my grip, attempting to secure the stranger's shoulders and pin him against the floorboards, but the thick fabric of his cape was loose, and he twisted within it like a captured eel. A heavy, iron-shod boot struck my shin with bruising, agonizing force. The pain flared hot and bright. Involuntarily loosening my grip for a fraction of a second, it was all the advantage our adversary required. With a violent, twisting heave, he wrenched himself free of the cape entirely, leaving me clutching the empty, heavy garment. The shop door flew open, the brass bell clanking wildly in protest. A thick tendril of yellow fog curled into the room as the shadow vanished into the alleyway without a single word. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the sharp throbbing in my leg, and rushed to the threshold. I drew my heavy service revolver from my pocket and peered out into the gloom. The fog was absolute, a wall of impenetrable yellow vapor. The muffled footsteps were already fading rapidly, echoing off the brickwork in a manner that made it entirely impossible to determine the direction of his flight. To blindly discharge my weapon into a London street was out of the question. Our quarry was gone. I turned back toward the interior of the shop, the cold damp of the street clinging to my clothes. Holmes was standing amidst the scattered stationery, his expression unreadable and entirely calm. He had not pursued the man. His attention was focused keenly elsewhere. "Are you injured, Watson?" "Only my pride," I replied, safely securing my revolver back in my coat pocket. "And my shin." The fellow had the sheer strength of a desperate man. Or a highly determined one," Holmes murmured. He stepped over a pile of spilled quills and approached the torn green velvet curtain. Beyond it lay a small windowless room containing a narrow cot, an enamel washstand, and a heavy iron safe built into the brickwork. The heavy steel door of the safe stood wide open, and Haligama remained huddled against the shelves in the main shop, weeping quietly into his hands, entirely broken. It was abundantly clear we would extract no coherent testimony from the stationer this afternoon. The shock of the near encounter had pushed his already fragile, nervous constitution over the precipice. Holmes dropped to one knee on the floorboards just outside the curtained threshold. He was examining something amid the debris of our physical struggle. When he stood, he held a small, dense book in his long fingers. It was bound in black Morocco leather, entirely devoid of any title, insignia, or tooling. "Our combatant was in a great hurry to vacate the premises," Holmes observed, brushing a speck of grey dust from the pristine leather cover. "In his haste to slip his skin and evade your rather excellent tackle, he left behind something far more valuable than his outerwear." I limped across the room to stand beside him. "Is that from the open safe?" "Indeed." The state of the back room and the trajectory of his flight suggest he had only just retrieved it when he realized he was cornered by our arrival. "It fell from his inner waistcoat pocket during your scuffle." Holmes opened the ledger. I leaned over his shoulder, expecting to see lists of illicit accounts, names of black market clients, or perhaps the financial records of the stationer's smuggled dyes. Instead, the thick vellum pages were densely packed with columns of seemingly random characters. There were Arabic numerals, ancient astrological symbols, and letters from the Greek alphabet, all meticulously rendered in tight, cramped handwriting using that same metallic galling that scented the dead air of the shop. "A cipher," I stated, recognizing the visual rhythm of the deception. "A very sophisticated one," Holmes agreed, turning the pages slowly, his eyes darting across the symbols. Irregular spacing suggests a polyalphabetic substitution, likely utilizing a shifting mathematical keyword. The sheer mental discipline required to maintain such an extensive log without a single visible correction or error is remarkable. Our departed friend is a man of rigid, obsessive habits and cold precision. Can you break it? Holmes paused on the final filled page of the ledger. His eyes narrowed, and a sudden, profound stillness came over him. The atmosphere in the room seemed to chill further. He did not answer my question. Instead, he drew the small fragment of crimson wax from his pocket and held it directly beside the open book. "Watson," he said, his voice dropping to a low, resonant register that sent an involuntary shiver down my spine. "The ink on this final entry is fresh. It lacks the matte finish of the earlier pages. It was written within the hour." I failed to see the immediate horror in that observation, Holmes. "You do not see it because you are looking at the ink, Doctor, and not the underlying structure of the text. Look closely at the far left margins." I leaned in and peered at the page. Beside the dense, impenetrable block of symbols, written in plain, unencoded English, was a neat vertical series of dates. I read them silently. Each date corresponded to a specific block of ciphered text. "They are sequential," I noted. "A diary of sorts, or a ledger of past transactions." Holmes slowly closed the book, the heavy leather cover slapping against the thick paper with a sound like a pistol shot in the quiet, ruined shop. He looked toward the open doorway, out into the swirling, impenetrable yellow fog where our quarry had vanished. "No, Watson," he said quietly, his grey eyes dark with sudden understanding. "They are not past transactions. The date beside the fresh ink we just examined is tomorrow. The encoded entries that follow span the entirety of the next month. Our phantom is not recording his crimes. He is scheduling them." Chapter 4. The Aristocrat's Ambition. The morning sun struggled to penetrate the thick yellow fog that pressed against the windows of our Baker Street sitting room, casting a jaundiced light across the cluttered floorboards. I sat in my armchair, a cold cup of tea at my elbow, observing my friend in the heavy silence. Holmes had not slept. The air in the room was dense with the acrid scent of strong shank tobacco and the faint metallic tang of the chemical reagents he had been utilizing the previous night. He was hunched over the deceased man's ledger, his long, pale fingers tracing the columns of seemingly random numerals. I noted the rigid tension in his shoulders and the shallow, rhythmic nature of his breathing. These were the physical markers of a mind operating at its absolute limits, entirely detached from the biological necessity of rest. He held a brass magnifying glass in his right hand, though he was not looking through it. His gaze was fixed on a point somewhere beyond the paper, passing the invisible architecture of the cipher. I had examined the ledger myself hours earlier. To my medical eye, the pages resembled the fevered scrawlings of a delirious patient, a chaotic assembly of dates and sums that corresponded to no known calendar or currency. Holmes, however, saw order where I saw only pathology. He reached for a dip pen, the steel nib scratching harshly against a fresh sheet of foolscap. He wrote 3 words, then set the pen down. He leaned back, closing his eyes, his breathing slowing to an imperceptible rhythm. "The cipher is built upon the Julian calendar, Watson," Holmes said, his voice a dry rasp that cut through the quiet room. A rudimentary but effective displacement. Our victim was not recording traditional financial transactions. He was recording debts of a far more perilous nature. Extortion, to be precise. I sat forward, the fatigue of the long night instantly banished by the sudden shift in his posture. Extortion against whom? Holmes turned the foolscap toward me. I read the name written in his precise, angular script. Lord Harrington. The name commanded immediate recognition. Lord Harrington was a figure of towering influence in the House of Lords, a man whose public reputation was built upon a foundation of ruthless political maneuvering and aristocratic disdain. He was wealthy, powerful, and notoriously vindictive. A man who destroyed careers with a whispered word in the corridors of Whitehall. "Read the corresponding figures, Watson," Holmes instructed, pointing a long, stained finger at the open ledger. "You will observe a pattern of escalating demands. Harrington's estates in Cornwall have been failing for 3 consecutive years. His investments in the South African diamond syndicates collapsed entirely last autumn. The man is a hollow facade. He faces utter, catastrophic financial ruin. Our victim held the promissory notes and the scandalous correspondence that could precipitate Harrington's destruction. With the extortionist dead, the debts vanish into the mist, a most compelling motive for murder. It is a vast leap from motive to murder, I observed, watching the smoke curl from his pipe toward the ceiling. Harrington is a man who employs others to dirty his hands. He does not stalk the alleyways of London himself. Indeed, Holmes replied, rising from his chair in a single fluid motion that belied his sleepless night. But you forget the seal, Watson, the wax that binds tomorrow to today. That requires a very specific instrument. An instrument a man like Harrington would never trust to a subordinate. Come, get your coat and your revolver. We have a morning call to pay in Mayfair. The journey across London was a study in profound contrasts. The clatter of our hansom cab echoed through the narrow, soot-stained streets of our immediate neighbourhood before giving way to the broad, meticulously swept avenues of the West End. The damp cold of the morning seeped through my heavy wool coat, chilling me to the bone. I found myself reflecting on the peculiar nature of the criminal mind. A desperate man in the East End might strike out with a blade for a handful of shillings to feed his children. A desperate aristocrat, fighting to preserve centuries of unearned privilege, was capable of a far colder, more calculated brutality. The preservation of status is a potent venom, blinding men to the fundamental boundaries of human morality. Grosvenor Square was quiet when we arrived, shrouded in the lingering morning mist. The Harrington residence was a massive, imposing structure of Portland stone, its tall windows dark and unyielding like the eyes of a fortress. We were admitted by a butler whose silent, severe demeanour mirrored the heavy architecture of the house. We were escorted down a long, shadowed hallway into a sprawling library. The room smelled intensely of old leather, beeswax, and the faint, unmistakable odour of dying orchids arranged in a silver vase near the heavy velvet curtains. Lord Harrington did not rise when we entered. He sat behind an expansive mahogany desk, the grey morning light catching the sharp, predatory angles of his face. He was a man in his late 50s, impeccably dressed in a dark morning coat, but my medical training drew my eye past his flawless tailoring. I noted the pronounced pallor of his skin beneath the aristocratic veneer, the dark hollows beneath his eyes, and a minute, uncontrollable tremor in his left eyelid. I observed the rapid, shallow pulse at his temple. The man was operating under immense, crushing strain, holding himself together by sheer force of will. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," Harrington said, his voice entirely devoid of warmth, echoing flatly in the cavernous room. "I am familiar with your reputation. You occupy yourself with the sordid troubles of the lower classes. I cannot imagine what business brings you to my door at this hour of the morning." "Murder is a remarkably egalitarian enterprise, Lord Harrington," Holmes said smoothly, stepping closer to the massive desk. "It visits the gutters and the palaces with equal enthusiasm. I am investigating the death of a man whose name I believe is intimately known to you." Holmes spoke the name of the victim. Harrington did not flinch. His breathing remained remarkably steady. Yet I saw the knuckles of his right hand whiten as he gripped the carved armrest of his leather chair. It was a microscopic betrayal of the body, a sudden tightening of tendons, that it spoke volumes to an observer trained to look for it. "I have never heard of the fellow," Harrington replied, his tone perfectly flat and dismissive. "If that is the extent of your inquiry, you may find your way out. The door is behind you." Holmes did not move. He stood perfectly still in the centre of the Persian rug, his pale eyes fixed entirely upon Harrington's hands. I followed his gaze. Upon the little finger of Harrington's right hand rested a heavy gold signet ring. The face of the ring bore a complex, archaic crest, intricate and deeply engraved. "A man in my profession must maintain a certain curiosity regarding antiquities," Holmes said, his voice taking on a casual, conversational rhythm that I knew intimately. It was the rhythm of a trap being meticulously set. "That is a fascinating piece of jewellery you wear, my lord. 14th century, if I am not mistaken. The crest of the House of York, slightly modified to include the falcon. It is a family heirloom," Harrington snapped, shifting his hand slightly so the ring was partially obscured by the immaculate white cuff of his shirt. "It does not concern you in the slightest." "It concerns me profoundly," Holmes countered, the casualness vanishing from his voice like breath on cold glass. "Because a perfect impression of that unique, modified crest was found pressed into the sealing wax of a letter retrieved from the dead man's pocket. A letter sealed with a chemical wax compound not yet available on the public market, applied with an instrument identical to the one upon your finger." The silence in the library became absolute, thick and suffocating. The slow ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner sounded like heavy hammer blows against an anvil. I watched Harrington carefully. The tremor in his eyelids ceased entirely. His face hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated malice. The facade of the bored, untouchable aristocrat fell away, revealing the desperate, cornered animal beneath the fine clothes. "You are treading on very dangerous ground, Mr. Holmes. You were treading on very dangerous ground, Mr. Holmes, Harrington whispered, leaning forward slightly. Men have disappeared from the streets of London for far less than such insolence. I possess friends in Whitehall who could ruin your life and your pathetic practice with a single signature. I prefer the signatures found on extortion ledgers, Holmes replied softly, his voice cutting through the threat with surgical precision. They are so much more authentic. The ledger in my possession details the exact sums you owed the deceased. It details the precise dates of your failed investments and the ruinous state of your Cornish estates. It paints a portrait of a man drowning, Lord Harrington. And drowning men will pull anyone down with them to reach the surface. Harrington stood slowly. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, and the physical threat he projected in that moment was considerable. I shifted my weight, dropping my right hand casually into the pocket of my coat where my heavy revolver rested. I did not draw the weapon, but the cold weight of the metal against my palm was a comforting reality. "You have a ledger," Harrington said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. "You have a theory. You have absolutely nothing else. A wax seal is not a confession. Anyone could have forged such a thing to frame me." "An exquisite theory," Holmes said, turning his back on the aristocrat and walking toward the door. "We shall see how it fares before a magistrate. Good day to you, Lord Harrington." We left the library without another word. The severe butler escorted us back out into the damp morning air of Grosvenor Square. The heavy oak door closed behind us with a resounding final thud. We walked in silence for an entire block, the mist swirling around our ankles. I felt a sudden, fierce surge of triumph. The case, which had seemed entirely impenetrable only hours before in Baker Street, had suddenly snapped into perfect, undeniable focus. The ledger provided the indisputable motive. The signet ring provided the exact method of the impossible seal. Harrington's visceral reaction provided the confirmation of his guilt. "We have him, Holmes," I said, matching his rapid, purposeful stride. "The man is terrified. He practically admitted to the forgery theory before we even accused him of the physical act of murder. We need only take the ledger to Scotland Yard. Inspector Lestrade can secure a warrant for the ring, and the match to the wax impression will be absolutely conclusive." Holmes stopped abruptly beneath a wrought-iron street lamp. The fog had begun to lift slightly, but his face remained deeply shadowed, his expression grim and unreadable. He withdrew his briar pipe from his pocket, but made no attempt to light it. He stared back down the grey street toward the looming silhouette of the Harrington residence. "It is entirely conclusive, Watson," Holmes murmured, his voice lacking any trace of satisfaction. "It is neat. It is perfectly logical. It is the inescapable deduction of a rational mind presented with empirical evidence." "Then why do you look as though you have just tasted bitter almonds?" I asked, studying his tense jawline. "Because, my dear doctor, we are being managed," Holmes said softly. His eyes locked onto mine, and the sudden chill in his voice had nothing to do with the damp London air. "Did you observe the ring closely, Watson? Did you observe the nature of the metal?" "I saw the crest," I replied, genuinely puzzled. "It matched your detailed description of the seal perfectly. The falcon, the modified shield. It was identical." "It was identical. But gold is a soft metal, Watson. A ring worn daily by a man of Harrington's age, passed down through generations of violent, active men, develops a distinct patina. It gathers microscopic abrasions from the ordinary friction of the world. The edges of a 14th century crest soften and wear down over hundreds of years of use." I considered the brief, tense glimpse I had caught of the heavy jewellery upon his trembling hand. I did not notice the wear. Holmes leaned closer, the fog dampening the collar of his coat, his voice dropping to a harsh, urgent whisper. "That is because there was none to notice. The ring upon Lord Harrington's finger is magnificent, Watson, but it is absolutely not a historical heirloom. The edges of the crest were razor-sharp. The gold was unblemished and flawless. It is a perfect, newly cast replica." I stared at him, the terrifying implications blooming slowly in my mind as the cold wind swept down the street. If the ring is newly made, then the impossible seal upon the letter was not made by the ring we just saw, Holmes finished, turning to face the distant, dark windows of the Harrington estate once more. "Lord Harrington is indeed a drowning man, Watson. But he did not kill our extortionist. He is wearing a forged ring because the true ring was stolen from him days ago. The seal was not a mistake left behind by a careless, desperate murderer. It was a signature left by the true architect of this crime, designed specifically to lead me to this exact house, at this exact hour, armed with a false deduction. "We have not solved a murder, Watson. We have merely walked into the center of a labyrinth precisely as we were invited to do." Chapter 5. The Stolen Signet. The heavy oak door of the drawing-room was closed against the damp chill of the London afternoon, but it did nothing to dispel the oppressive atmosphere within. Inside, the air was stifling, thick with the smell of old paper, beeswax, and the sharp metallic tang of human terror. Lord Harrington sat behind his massive mahogany desk, a man visibly disintegrating before our eyes. As a medical man, I noted the signs of his acute physical distress with clinical detachment. His breathing was shallow and painfully rapid, the pulse at his temple fluttering erratically beneath translucent skin. A fine sheen of cold perspiration coated his pale brow, and his hands, resting flat upon the green blotting paper, trembled with a continuous, uncontrollable vibration. Inspector Lestrade stood over the nobleman, exuding the profound and unshakable satisfaction of a hound that had finally driven a fox into a blind alley. The Scotland Yard detective rocked back on his heels, his heavy breathing audible in the quiet room, the brass buttons of his thick overcoat catching the dim yellowish light from the hissing gas fixtures above. Lestrade had brought the physical evidence of his triumph, laying the forged letter upon the desk with a theatrical flourish that I found entirely distasteful. Beside the parchment, he carefully placed a small plaster cast of the wax seal, a perfect negative image of the aristocratic crest that had initiated this grim and bloody affair. Lestrade cleared his throat, a wet and heavy sound entirely devoid of sympathy. He declared that the chase was concluded, stating with absolute certainty that the crest pressed into the crimson wax was an exact and undeniable match to the Harrington family signet. He detailed the heraldic elements with ponderous, exhausting accuracy, pointing his thick finger at the twin rampant lions and the severed serpent. He stated that the murdered man had been found clutching this very threat in the filthy alleyway, and that the unassailable proof of the nobleman's guilt lay hardened in the wax before them. Reaching into the deep pocket of his coat, Lestrade produced a pair of heavy iron handcuffs, the metal links clinking sharply in the hushed room. He announced his formal intention to take Lord Harrington into immediate custody for the crime of murder. Harrington opened his mouth to mount a protest, but only a dry, pitiful rasp emerged from his throat. He looked wildly toward the tall glass windows, his eyes darting toward the street below, as if contemplating a desperate, fatal leap to escape the crushing weight of the inspector's accusation. My friend Sherlock Holmes had remained standing by the marble fireplace throughout this entire exchange, a silent, motionless silhouette against the glowing embers of the hearth. He had not removed his grey ulster nor his glove since we arrived. His eyes, keen and piercing beneath the brim of his hat, had been fixed not upon the incriminating letter or the plaster cast, but entirely upon the nobleman's trembling hands. Just as Lestrade took a heavy step forward to apply the iron manacles, Holmes moved. His intervention was not loud, but it possessed a sudden, striking authority that severed the tension in the room and halted the inspector in his tracks. Holmes commanded Lestrade to put the irons away at once. He stated in a voice devoid of emotion that the arrest would be a monumental error, one that would make Scotland Yard the absolute laughingstock of the London press before the week was out. Lestrade bristled immediately, his face flushing a dull, angry red from his collar to his hairline. He demanded to know how Holmes could possibly dispute the physical evidence, gesturing wildly at the matching heraldic crests resting on the mahogany desk. Holmes crossed the room in 3 long, deliberate strides. He did not spare a single glance for the letter. Instead, he reached out and grasped Lord Harrington by the left wrist, pulling the trembling hand forward and turning it palm upward toward the gaslight, and slowly flipping it over. He instructed the angry inspector to look closely at the third finger of the nobleman's left hand. I stepped closer to observe the anatomy in question. The skin of Harrington's hands was entirely smooth and uncalloused, the unmistakable hands of a gentleman of leisure who had never known a day of manual labour. But on the third finger, right at the base of the knuckle, there was a distinct and undeniable band of paler skin. It was a faint but clear mark left by a heavy ring, an area of flesh completely protected from the sun and the weather, while the surrounding skin of his hands had tanned slightly from recent outdoor pursuits. Holmes pointed a long finger at the pale band. He stated that Lord Harrington had clearly worn a heavy signet ring on that finger for many years, a piece of jewellery large enough to block the sun and leave a permanent shadow on the skin. He then turned his sharp gaze upon the terrified nobleman and asked him precisely how long the family signet had been missing from his hand. Harrington swallowed hard, finding a fragile fraction of his voice at last. He whispered that the ring had been gone for exactly 3 weeks. He explained, his words tumbling out in a desperate rush, that it had been stolen from his private locker in the dressing room of the St. James Club while he was bathing. Lestrade let out a harsh, barking laugh that echoed unpleasantly off the wood-panelled walls. He dismissed the story instantly, calling it the most convenient theft in the long and varied history of London crime. He argued vehemently that any man facing the hangman's noose would claim his weapon had been stolen by a mysterious and unseen stranger. Holmes did not argue. He simply reached into the deep inner pocket of his ulster and drew out a neatly folded square of newspaper. He tossed it onto the desk beside the plaster cast. He instructed Lestrade to read the circled advertisement in the personal column of the Times. He noted that the publication date at the top of the page was exactly 3 weeks prior to the murder in the alley. I leaned over Lestrade's shoulder and read the tiny, densely packed text. It was a formal reward notice, offering the substantial sum of £50 for the safe return of a gold signet ring bearing the Harrington crest, reportedly stolen from the premises of the St. James Club. The date of the publication was absolute and irrefutable. Holmes spoke with devastating clinical precision. He pointed out that Lord Harrington could not possibly possess the gift of prophecy. He could not have known a murder would be committed 3 weeks in the future. He stated that a man planning a brutal assassination does not advertise the loss of his primary murder weapon in the national press weeks before the crime actually occurs. He concluded that the true murderer had stolen the rings specifically to cast suspicion upon the Harrington family, or far more likely, to utilize the authority of the aristocratic crest for a completely different and far darker purpose. Lestrade stood dumbfounded, his jaw slack, the heavy iron handcuffs dangling uselessly from his thick fingers. The entire foundation of his meticulous case had crumbled to absolute dust in a matter of seconds. He looked at Holmes, his voice dropping to a remarkably subdued tone, and asked why anyone would go to such elaborate lengths to steal a nobleman's ring merely to stamp a drop of wax on a blackmail letter. Holmes turned away from the desk and began to pace the length of the drawing room, his hands firmly clasped behind his back. The restless, kinetic energy that always possessed him when he finally caught the scent of a true puzzle had completely taken over his frame. He stated that they had all been looking at the crime through the entirely wrong lens. They had assumed the deceased in the alley was a mere victim of high society greed, a desperate blackmailer who had simply pushed an aristocrat too far. Holmes declared that this fundamental assumption was completely false. He reached into his coat once more and produced the small water-damaged leather notebook we had recovered from the hidden lining of the dead man's coat the previous night. Holmes held the little book up to the gaslight. He explained that he had spent the quiet, undisturbed hours between midnight and dawn examining the strange numerical sequences jotted within its stained pages. He had initially believed them to be ledgers of extortion, records of illicit debts and shameful payments. But the mathematical structure was entirely wrong for currency. The numbers corresponded instead to nautical coordinates, cargo tonnage, and the shifting times of the river tides. He stopped his pacing and turned to Lord Harrington, asking the nobleman a sudden question regarding the shipping interests of his vast estate. Harrington, still pale but slowly regaining a fraction of his aristocratic composure, explained that his family owned extensive and historic warehouses along the East India Docks. He added that the Harrington family crest was legally recognized by the Crown, used to authorize the passage of certain bonded goods through the customs authority without the requirement of a physical inspection, a royal privilege granted to their estate over a century ago. The silence that followed this revelation was profound as the massive implication of these words slowly settled upon us. I saw the sudden flash of comprehension widen Lestrade's eyes, quickly followed by a shadow of genuine creeping alarm. Holmes stated that the dead man in the alley was never a blackmailer. He was an investigator. Whether he was an independent agent, a private inquiry man, or a frightened participant looking for a desperate way out of a criminal enterprise, he had uncovered a vast conspiracy. He had found a smuggling syndicate operating with utter impunity right under the watchful nose of the Port Authority. Holmes detailed the mechanics of the operation with a chilling, rapid clarity. The syndicates had targeted Lord Harrington, stealing the signet ring to forge the necessary authorization seals. With the nobleman's recognized crest stamped securely into the wax of their shipping manifests, their private vessels could bypass customs inspectors entirely. They were bringing in illicit cargo on a massive, unprecedented scale, their crates untouched and completely unexamined by the law. The deceased had discovered this invisible network. He had tracked their nighttime movements, logged the names of their ships in his hidden notebook, and somehow secured a piece of the forged wax document as his final proof. The syndicate had realized he was an existential threat to their empire. They hunted him down, murdered him in the fog-choked alleyway, and left the forged letter on his body to misdirect the police toward a scandal in high society. I found my voice and interjected, asking my friend about the impossible date pressed into the wax seal, the date of tomorrow. I reminded Holmes that we had all assumed it was a cruel threat, a specific deadline given to the victim before he was ultimately killed. Holmes stopped pacing and stared at me, his grey eyes hard, glittering, and entirely unyielding. He walked slowly back to the mahogany desk and stared down at the plaster cast of the serpent and lions. He stated that the date was never a deadline for a murder. The victim was already dead when the letter was planted. The wax seal repossessed was actually a torn fragment of a forged bill of lading, a customs document prepared in advance for a ship that had not yet made port. The syndicate had stamped the papers with the stolen ring, preparing for a massive arrival, and the deceased had managed to tear away the corner of the manifest before they caught and silenced him. Holmes picked up the leather notebook and flipped to the final, water-stained page. He ran his long, pale index finger down a column of cramped figures until he stopped at the very bottom of the leaf. He read the final line aloud in a voice devoid of comfort. It was a numerical designation for a heavy merchant vessel, its massive displacement tonnage, and a precise tidal coordinate for a specific berth at the East India Docks. Holmes looked up from the book, the sharp angles of his face cast in stark shadow by the hissing gaslight. He stated that the future date in the wax was the scheduled arrival of the syndicate's primary vessel. The ship was entering the mouth of the River Thames on the evening tide. He closed the leather book with a sharp, violent snap that echoed like a pistol shot in the silent room. He turned his piercing gaze upon the Strad, instructing the inspector to gather his absolute best men from the yard, and advising him with deadly seriousness to arm them heavily. The cargo arriving under the unquestioned protection of the stolen signet was not smuggled silk, nor untaxed tea, nor spices. Based on the enormous displacement figures recorded by the murdered man, the syndicate was moving enough stolen military munitions into the heart of London to arm an entire rebellion. And that ship, Holmes noted with a slow, deliberate glance at the brass clock ticking relentlessly upon the mantelpiece, was scheduled to drop its anchor in exactly 3 hours. Chapter 6. The Mains Leviathan. The smell of the river was the smell of London itself, a thick concoction of brine, rotting timber, and coal smoke that clung to the damp wool of my ulster. We had departed a hansom cab at the edge of Wapping, descending the slippery stone stairs toward the muddy banks of the Thames. The tide was out, exposing a vast expanse of glistening brown sludge, littered with the bones of forgotten vessels and the detritus of the greatest metropolis on earth. Holmes walked ahead of me, his lantern unlit, his long strides picking a precise path over the treacherous ground. He moved not with the caution of a man afraid of the filth, but with the calculated efficiency of a heron stalking the shallows. The air was bitterly cold, carrying a dampness that settled deep into the joints. I kept my hand resting near the heavy revolver in my coat pocket, my military instincts roused by the profound isolation of this stretch of the river. To our left, the black water slapped lethargically against the rotting pilings. To our right rose a sheer cliff face of abandoned wharves and decaying brick warehouses, their shattered windows staring out like blind eyes over the water. It was a place where things were meant to be forgotten. Holmes halted, raising a solitary hand. I stopped behind him, my breath pluming in the freezing air. He stood perfectly still, his head tilted slightly, listening. I strained my own ears, catching nothing but the distant groan of a tugboat and the rhythmic lapping of the tide. Yet Holmes had caught some dissonance in the environment. He pointed a long finger toward a hulking silhouette leaning precipitously over the mudflats. It was a warehouse of formidable proportions, constructed of blackened timber and brick, its roof sagging under the weight of decades of neglect. A massive set of double doors faced the river, sealed shut with rusted chains. From a distance, it appeared entirely derelict. But as we approached, stepping carefully over rotting planks and rusted iron chains, my eye caught the subtle discrepancies that Holmes had undoubtedly noted from 50 yards away. The mud leading to the side entrance was deeply churned, the edges of the impression sharp and unweathered by the previous night's rain. The path had been used and used heavily within the last 10 hours. "We require no light just yet, Watson," Holmes murmured, his voice barely rising above the sound of the water. "Let our eyes adjust to their shadows before we invite them to look upon ours." I nodded, recognizing the tactical wisdom. We slipped through a narrow side door that hung loosely on a single leather hinge. The interior of the warehouse was a cavern of suffocating darkness. The air was dead, smelling intensely of mildew, stale tobacco, and a sharp metallic odor that I recognized instantly. It was the scent of cordite, fresh and unmistakable, mingling with the underlying stench of the river. We stood in silence for 3 full minutes. The darkness slowly retreated, giving way to a grey monochrome as the scant ambient light from the river filtered through the cracked roof tiles. The scale of the operation became evident. This was no abandoned ruin. The vast floor of the warehouse was dominated by stacks of wooden crates, arranged with military precision. There was an architecture to the stacking, forming narrow corridors and blind corners that made me grip my revolver tighter. The space was utterly silent, but the physical remnants of human presence were overwhelming. I noted the scuff marks of heavy boots on the damp floorboards, the stray wisps of straw used for packing, and the distinct absence of dust on the crates at eye level. Holmes moved fluidly down the central aisle, finally sliding the shutter of his dark lantern just enough to cast a thin, focused beam of yellow light over the wooden surfaces. He paused at a crate that had been pried open, its lid resting haphazardly against the side. I stepped beside him, peering into the interior. It was packed tightly with oiled paper and sawdust. Within the packing lay rows of heavy, cylindrical objects forged of dull iron. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cold metal. The machining was immaculate, the design intricate and decidedly modern. "Rifle breech blocks," I said, keeping my voice low. "High-grade ordnance, and entirely unregistered, judging by the filed serial numbers on the casing. This is no petty smuggling ring, Holmes. This is the outfitting of a small army. Your military eye serves us well, Watson," he replied, shifting the lantern beam to the floor, "but the ordnance is merely the currency. It is the transactions of men that leave the more telling marks. Look here." He knelt, bringing the light close to the floorboards. I crouched beside him. The wood was heavily stained with grease and mud, but beneath the grime a distinct pattern of scuffs was visible. 3 men, Holmes stated, his voice devoid of inflection. 2 carrying heavy loads, wearing hobnailed boots of a common dockworker variety. The 3rd man wears a bespoke riding boot with a pronounced heel. He does not carry. He directs. He stood here, pivoting on his right heel, watching the labor, and he was nervous. I looked closely at the floor. A small scattering of white ash lay near the pivot marks, alongside several half-smoked cigarettes that had been crushed violently underfoot. He smoked Turkish tobacco, I observed, and he discarded them long before they were finished. A man in a state of high agitation. Precisely, Watson, but what agitated him? Holmes stood, sweeping the narrow beam of light further down the aisle. The beam caught the edge of a heavy canvas tarp thrown hastily over a mound in the corner. We approached it together. The metallic smell of cordite grew fainter here, replaced by something entirely different. It was a heavy, coppery scent that registered in my medical mind with sickening clarity. I took the edge of the stiff canvas and pulled it back. The secondary crime scene was not a sprawling display of violence, but a concentrated, brutal tableau. A heavy wooden chair sat in the center of a cleared space. Beside it lay a small table holding a tin wash basin. The water in the basin was black, crusted at the edges with dried, coagulated blood. The floorboards around the chair were saturated, the dark stains spreading outward in a starburst pattern. I stepped forward, examining the scene with the clinical detachment required of my profession. I noted the absence of a body, but the remaining fluid told a complete story. "Arterial spray," I said, pointing to a distinct line of dark droplets arcing across the side of a nearby crate. The victim was seated, a laceration to the carotid or jugular, delivered from behind. Given the volume of blood soaked into the wood and the level of coagulation, I would place the event roughly 8 to 12 hours ago. Early this morning. Holmes was already examining the table. He did not look at the blood. He looked at the empty space beside the basin. "The killer washed his hands," Holmes said. "He used a rough lye soap, leaving a sliver upon the table. He then dried his hands on a linen towel, which he took with him. He was not panicked. He was not panicked. He was thorough, yet he left in a hurry. How can you be certain of the haste? I asked, surveying the grim surroundings. Because he left the very thing he came to retrieve. Holmes reached into his coat and produced a pair of long tweezers. From a narrow crack between the floorboards, inches from the leg of the bloody chair, he extracted a small folded piece of paper. It had been partially submerged in the blood, the edges stiff and dark. He unfolded it with agonizing care, holding it beneath the thin beam of the lantern. I leaned in to read the script. It was a shipping manifest, stamped with the seal of the Port of London Authority. The date of departure was clearly marked. "Tomorrow," I whispered, feeling the cold of the warehouse seep deeper into my bones. "The tide charts on the reverse side confirm it. They are moving the entire cash on the morning tide. And they are leaving no loose ends," Holmes added, his eyes locked on the paper. "The man who sat in this chair was a liability. The transaction is complete, the goods are secured, and the vessel is prepared. By tomorrow afternoon, the men responsible for the forged letters, the wax, and this butchery will be beyond the jurisdiction of Scotland Yard." "Then we must alert Lestrade immediately," I said, turning toward the door. "A blockade of the docks, a coordinated sweep of the outgoing vessels. We have the manifest. We know the time." Holmes did not move. He stood staring down at the bloody floorboards, the lantern light casting harsh angles across his aquiline features. His silence was profound, and I knew better than to interrupt the rapid, unseen calculations occurring within his mind. "Watson," he said finally, his voice unnervingly quiet. "Yes, Holmes. Look at the volume of blood upon the floor. Look at the chair. Look at the trajectory of the spray you so astutely identified." I looked again at the grim scene. "The volume is significant. As I said, a fatal wound." "Fatal, yes," Holmes agreed. "But look at the bindings on the chair." I stepped closer, my pulse quickening as I noticed what I had missed in the dim light. Heavy leather straps hung from the arms and legs of the chair. They were completely pristine. Not a drop of blood marred their surface. Furthermore, they were unbuckled. The victim was not tied down, I breathed, the realization chilling me. He sat there willingly. Holmes closed the shutter of the lantern, plunging us back into the suffocating gloom of the warehouse. He sat willingly, Watson, and the killer washed his hands with the calm precision of a surgeon. The man who bled in that chair was not an enemy they were eliminating. He was a piece of their puzzle who had served his final purpose. And based on the specific ash of the Turkish tobacco discarded by our nervous overseer, the man who stood by and watched the slaughter was the very man who hired us to prevent it. In the darkness, the faint, rhythmic slapping of the Thames against the pilings sounded entirely like the ticking of a clock that we could no longer stop. "What exactly are they shipping tomorrow, Watson?" Holmes whispered into the black air. "If they required a man to bleed out to seal the cargo." If they required a man to bleed out to seal the cargo. Chapter 7. The Blue. Pigman. The acrid tang of hydrochloric acid cut through the familiar fugue of shag tobacco in our Baker Street rooms. For 3 hours, Holmes had remained hunched over his makeshift chemical bench, a veritable alchemist amidst a chaotic array of glass retorts, Bunsen burners and porcelain evaporating dishes. He possessed a resting heart rate that would envy a hibernating bear when engaged in thought, yet his hands moved with the rapid, ceaseless precision of a concert pianist. I sat by the window, ostensibly reading a medical journal, but my attention was drawn entirely to the singular, brilliant smear of blue resting upon a glass slide under his microscope. The rain lashed against the window panes, a steady, rhythmic drumming, but mirrored the measured ticking of the mantel clock. Holmes straightened up, adjusting the brass focus knob with a long, stained finger. He did not speak, but the rigid set of his shoulders told me he had found whatever phantom he sought. Heavy, deliberate footsteps sounded on the stairs, followed by a sharp rap at the door. Inspector Lestrade entered without waiting for an invitation. The Scotland Yard man brought the damp chill of the London streets in with him, his bowler hat dripping water onto Mrs. Hudson's patterned rug. His face was flushed, his chest puffed with the unmistakable air of a man who believed he had outpaced his betters. He removed his coat, shaking it with unnecessary violence. I noted the shallowness of his breath and the slight tremor of adrenaline in his jaw. Lestrade was preparing for a confrontation. "The matter is concluded, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade announced, warming his hands by the grate. "I have the warrants signed and in my pocket. Lord Harrington will be spending his evening in the cells of Bow Street. The evidence is entirely unassailable." Holmes did not turn from his microscope. He merely picked up a glass pipette, drew a measure of clear fluid from a vial, and let a single drop fall upon the slide. "Is that so, Lestrade?" Holmes murmured, his voice barely rising above the hiss of the gas jet. Lestrade took a step toward the center of the room, eager to command the stage. Harrington had the motive. We know he owed Thorne a small fortune in gambling debts Thorne was threatening to make public. We know Harrington was seen near the counting house on the night Thorne was struck down. The man is an aristocrat, yes, but a desperate one. A cornered fox will bite just as hard as a stray dog. I found myself nodding in reluctant agreement. Harrington possessed the arrogance of his station, a man accustomed to solving his problems by sweeping them under the rug. When confronted during our initial inquiry, his pulse had raced visibly at the base of his throat, and his pupils had dilated in what I, as a medical man, recognized as acute panic. Holmes finally turned, wiping his hands upon a stained rag. He looked at Lestrade with the mild, terrifying curiosity of a lepidopterist examining a particularly unremarkable moth. "A cornered fox indeed," Holmes said softly, "but Harrington is a man of the turf. He spends his days examining the fetlocks of thoroughbreds, and his evenings drinking port at the Diogenes Club. He is entirely innocent of this crime, Lestrade, and if you execute that warrant, you will be the laughing-stock of every newspaper from here to Edinburgh." Lestrade bristled, his face darkening. "You go too far, Holmes. The letter itself condemns him. The blackmail threat was found on Thorney's desk, crushed under his own hand." "Ah, the letter," Holmes replied, stepping away from the bench and gesturing toward the dining table, where the fatal missive lay encased in a protective glass folder. "The letter sealed with tomorrow's wax. You have built a gallows of assumptions, Inspector, but you have failed to examine the rope. Come here." Lestrade approached with heavy reluctance, and I rose to join them. Holmes tapped the glass directly above the broken crimson wax seal. "What do you see, Lestrade?" "A wax seal," the inspector replied, his tone defensive. "Broken when Thorne opened the threat. You see, but you do not observe," Holmes said, his voice cold and precise. "I see a timeline. I see a geography. I see the absolute exoneration of Lord Harrington. Look closely at the fractured edge of the wax. Do not look at the crimson. Look at what is caught within it." I leaned in, my eyes adjusting to the lamplight. There, embedded deep within the matrix of the hardened wax, were microscopic specks of a vibrant, unnatural hue. It was the same vivid shade that rested on Holmes' glass slide across the room. "Blue dust," I muttered, entirely bewildered. "Excellent, Watson. Blue dust. To be specific, lapis lazuli of the highest conceivable purity. It is an ancient pigment, ground from stone mined in the mountains of Afghanistan. In the Renaissance, it was worth more than its weight in gold. Today, artists use synthetic ultramarine, a cheap chemical equivalent. But this is the genuine article, the true ancient stone." Lestrade crossed his arms. "And what does this signify? Harrington is a rich man. He could afford rare paints. He could," Holmes agreed. "But why would he? There is not a single canvas in Harrington's townhouse. He possesses no artistic temperament. More importantly, this pigment was not painted onto the wax. It was transferred into the wax while the crimson was still molten. The person who sealed this letter was covered in the dust of crushed lapis lazuli. It fell from their sleeves, from their hands, straight into the pool of hot wax." Holmes paced the length of the room, his energy sudden and electric. "Harrington was seen near the counting house, yes, because he was desperately trying to negotiate his debt. But he did not strike Thorne down. He did not draft that letter. The letter was a fabrication, created to frame Harrington, and to obscure the true nature of the crime." "Then who in God's name did it?" Lestrade demanded, his confidence finally cracking. Holmes stopped before the fireplace, staring into the flames. "Cast your mind back, Watson, to yesterday morning. We interviewed Elias Thorne's surviving business partner in the counting house, Mr. Silas Vance. I recalled the man instantly. A slender, nervous individual with a complexion like old parchment. I had noted his shallow breathing and the slight rhythmic twitch in his left eyelid, an indicator of severe nervous strain. But it was not his face that had drawn my attention. It was his clothing. He was wearing a suit of fine broadcloth, I said slowly, tracing the memory. But his trousers were marred. There was a pale residue on the knees. I assumed at the time he had been chalking a billiard cue and leaned against the table. "You saw the residue, Watson. But you misdiagnosed the ailment," Holmes said sharply. "It was not billiard chalk. It was drafting powder. Vance is an architect by training, though he operates as a financier. He maintains a private drafting room at the rear of the counting house. I took the liberty of examining the floorboards outside his door while you were occupied asking him about Thorn's enemies. Holmes reached into his waistcoat pocket and produced a small glass vial. Inside was a pinch of powder. He uncorked it and tipped a fraction onto a sheet of white paper. It was grey, ordinary dust, until Holmes held it close to the gaslight. Hidden within the grey were microscopic, glittering fragments of intense blue. Vance is an amateur antiquarian, Holmes explained, his words clipping together in rapid succession. He restores illuminated manuscripts. It is a costly, obsessive hobby. He grinds his own lapis lazuli to recreate the authentic medieval pigments. He was kneeling in his drafting room, perhaps retrieving a dropped tool from the floor, when he realized he had the perfect opportunity to murder his partner and seize total control of the firm. He drafted the false blackmail letter, knelt to seal it, and the dust from his trousers and cuffs contaminated the wax. Lestrade's jaw slackened. Vance, but he was weeping when we spoke to him. He appeared utterly devastated by Thorney's death. Tears are the easiest fluid to manufacture, Inspector, Holmes replied coldly. Vance murdered Thorn. He used Harrington's gambling debts as a smokescreen, planting the letter on the desk to lead you precisely where you have gone. The room fell silent save for the drumming rain. The sheer mechanical logic of Holmes' deduction hung in the air, undeniable and complete. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp drafts of Baker Street. Then I must change the name on the warrant, Lestrade muttered, reaching into his pocket for a pencil. We can take Vance at his home in Mayfair tonight. No, Holmes said, his voice dropping to a low, warning register. Not tonight. Lestrade paused, his pencil hovering over the paper. Why in heaven's name not? We have the motive, we have the means, and you have provided the physical proof. Because you are forgetting the most crucial detail of this entire affair, Holmes said. He walked slowly back to the table, his eyes locked on the glass folder. You are forgetting the seal itself. I stood beside him, looking down at the broken crimson wax. The blue specks glittered like trapped stars. The letter was dated for tomorrow, I said, the realization settling heavily in my chest. Precisely, Watson. Holmes leaned over the table, his sharp features cast in harsh shadows by the overhead lamp. Vance is a meticulous man. A man who grinds his own medieval pigments does not make a simple clerical error regarding the date of a blackmail demand. He dated the letter for tomorrow because the murder of Elias Thorn was not the culmination of his plan, it was merely the prologue. Holmes looked up, his grey eyes piercing the gloom of the room. Vance is waiting for something. A transaction, a shipment, a convergence of events that can only occur on the date stamped upon that parchment. If we arrest him tonight, he remains silent, and whatever catastrophe he has set in motion will proceed unimpeded. We do not know what tomorrow brings, Watson. We only know that blood has already been spilled to ensure it happens. Chapter 8. The Jubilee Trap. The morning air tasted of coal smoke, crushed laurel leaves, and the metallic tang of impending rain, though the sky above London remained a flawless, unforgiving blue. The roar of the city was not its usual mechanical grind, but a surging, organic beast. The Queen had occupied the throne for 50 years, and the Jubilee had drawn half the empire to the streets of the capital. A sea of humanity pressed against the barricades along Whitehall, bunting in brilliant reds and blues draped from every balcony, snapping in the stiff breeze. As a military man, I have never cared for crowds of such magnitude. A mass of people is a tactical nightmare. There are too many moving parts, too many hands concealed in pockets, too many sudden shifts in the tide of bodies. I stood with my back pressed against the rough granite of a municipal building, my right hand resting lightly inside the pocket of my coat. The heavy, cold steel of my Webley revolver was a small comfort against the sheer weight of the noise. Beside me, Sherlock Holmes was a study in absolute stillness. He had discarded his usual attire for the rough canvas jacket, heavy boots, and flat cap of a dockland labourer. His hands were smeared with soot, and he had adopted a slight stoop that erased his imposing height. Yet, to my medical eye, his disguise could not mask the predatory tension in his frame. His breathing was slow and measured, his gaze fixed unblinkingly on a specific architectural detail across the street. We were watching a heavy wrought iron gate that guarded a narrow, disused service alley behind the Foreign Exchange Bank. The parade route ran directly past this point, ensuring that the noise and chaos would be at its absolute peak just as the target arrived. Holmes had deduced that the smuggled fortune, the very heart of the conspiracy, had been hidden in the hollow masonry beside that gate days before the perimeter was secured by Scotland Yard. The thief would have only one window of opportunity to retrieve it, masked by the thunder of the marching guards. The heat of the morning was becoming oppressive. The smell of roasted chestnuts from a nearby vendor mingled sickeningly with the odours of damp wool, unwashed bodies, and the sharp ammonia scent of the police horses forming a line 50 yards away. I noted the pulse beating steadily at my own wrist. The anticipation was a heavy physical weight. Holmes did not fidget. He did not check his pocket watch. He existed entirely in the space between the passing seconds, waiting for the anomaly in the crowd that would signal the arrival of our quarry. The distant blare of brass instruments announced the approach of the vanguard. The crowd surged forward, a collective wave of enthusiasm that crushed the breath from my lungs. The ground beneath my boots began to vibrate with the rhythmic, synchronized march of the infantry. The noise swelled into a deafening wall of sound. And then I saw him. Arthur Pendleton, the respected business partner of our murdered client, looked entirely out of place in the throng. His usually immaculate tailoring was crumpled. His silk cravat was askew, and his bowler hat sat too low on his forehead. As he pushed his way to the front of the crowd near the iron gate, I observed his physical deterioration. His face was the colour of old parchment. He was perspiring heavily, the sweat cutting clean tracks through the dust on his cheeks. His jaw muscles worked in rapid, uncontrolled spasms. He was a man driven by a desperate, consuming terror. He cast erratic glances over his shoulder, his eyes wide and unseeing, blinded by his own panic. Holmes tapped my forearm once. It was the signal. We began to move through the crush of bodies, using the shifting tide of the spectators to mask our approach. Pendleton reached the iron gate just as the lifeguards rode past. The clatter of hundreds of hooves on the cobblestones drowned out all other sound. Pendleton pressed himself against the masonry pillar beside the gate. His hands, trembling violently, reached up to a decorative bronze rosette set into the stone. He grasped the metal and twisted. The rosette, along with a small block of the surrounding stone, slid smoothly outward. Pendleton reached into the dark cavity. The tendons in his neck strained. He withdrew a heavy rectangular package wrapped in dark canvas and bound with thick twine. The relief that washed over his features was instantaneous and profound, but it was destined to be agonizingly brief. I stepped up behind him on his left, while Holmes flanked his right. I seized Pendleton by the wrist, my fingers digging precisely into the space between the bone and the radial nerve. The sudden, agonizing pressure paralyzed his hand. His fingers sprang open, and the heavy canvas package dropped. Holmes caught it with blinding speed before it could strike the pavement. Pendleton gasped, spinning around to face us. I maintained my grip on his arm, twisting it sharply downward to unbalance him. His knees buckled slightly, and I felt the fight leave his body before he even realized he was caught. His breath came in ragged, shallow wheezes. The smell of sour perspiration and stale brandy radiated from him. He looked from my stern face to the soot-stained labourer holding his prize, and then the light of recognition dawned in his terrified eyes. "The game ends here, Pendleton," Holmes said. His voice was low, cutting effortlessly through the ambient roar of the cheering crowd. "You overplayed your hand. You relied on the parade for cover, but you forgot that a spectacle draws eyes as well as distracting them." Pendleton tried to speak, but his throat worked soundlessly. His lips were completely bloodless. I could feel the erratic, galloping rhythm of his pulse beneath my thumb. He was hovering on the edge of a sheer physical collapse. "You murdered him for this," I said, keeping my voice steady and cold. "You slaughtered your own partner, forged the ledgers, and blamed a phantom. And for what? For a canvas sack of stolen futures." Pendleton finally found a fraction of his voice. His words were a wet, desperate whisper. "You do not understand. I had to. If I did not bring the payment today, they were going to kill my family. I am already a dead man. The wax, the seal, you saw what it meant." Holmes did not respond to the man pleading. He stepped back into the shadow of the masonry archway, shielding the package from the jostling crowd. He set the canvas bundle upon a projecting ledge of the stone wall. Pendleton sagged against my grip, his eyes locked on the package with a morbid, inescapable dread. Holmes produced a clasp knife from his rough coat. With two precise, economical movements he severed the thick twine. He pulled back the folds of the dark canvas. Beneath the fabric lay a polished mahogany box, secured with a simple brass latch. It was heavy, perfectly sized to hold the stolen bearer bonds and the South African diamonds we had been hunting. "A fitting coffin for your ambitions," Holmes murmured. He flipped the brass latch. The lid swung open on silent hinges. I braced myself for the gleam of uncut stones or the crisp edges of financial ruin. Instead, the box contained nothing of the sort. I felt a sudden, sharp chill settle at the base of my spine, completely at odds with the stifling heat of the morning. The mahogany box was filled to the brim with fine grey ash. Holmes stared at the contents. The stillness in his frame was no longer the calculated weight of a hunter. It was the sudden, rigid shock of a man who has just stepped onto a trapdoor. He reached into the bed of ashes with two long, pale fingers. Resting just beneath the surface was a single, pristine white envelope. Holmes lifted it into the light. There was no name written upon the paper. He turned it over. The flap was secured with a thick pool of crimson wax, stamped with the image of a fractured hourglass. It was the exact seal that had initiated this bloody affair. "We were expected, Watson," Holmes said, his voice stripped of all its usual quiet triumph. He broke the crimson seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper within. He read the words in silence, and I saw the muscles of his jaw tighten until the bones shone white beneath his skin. "What does it say, Holmes?" I asked, the weight of the moment pressing down upon me heavier than the crowd. "Who sent it?" Holmes turned the paper so I could read the single line of elegant flowing script. The date inscribed at the top was not today, it was tomorrow. The message below it contained only 4 words. "Look to your doctor." Chapter 9. The Architecture of Dejetate. The fire in our Baker Street sitting room crackled with a steady, comforting rhythm, a stark contrast to the relentless drumming of the London rain against the window glass. We had returned from the holding cells at Scotland Yard less than an hour prior, leaving behind the frantic shouting of constables and the sullen, defeated silence of our captured quarry. My heavy winter coat still hung damp upon the hook by the door, the scent of wet wool mingling with the sharp, acidic tang of the strong shag tobacco Holmes was presently packing into his blackened clay pipe. He stood by the mantelpiece, his sharp, aquiline profile silhouetted against the amber glow of the hearth. For a long while the only sounds were the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, and the occasional hiss of a dying ember falling into the ash. The chaotic violence of the evening had passed, replaced by the quiet, surgical precision of the aftermath. It is in these rare moments, when the trap has sprung and the adrenaline begins to fade from the blood, that the true architecture of a crime reveals itself to my companion. I watched him strike a long wooden match against the brickwork, the brief sulphurous flare illuminating the hollows of his cheeks and the intense calculating light in his grey eyes. I broke the silence first. I told him that as a medical man I remained deeply troubled by the physical condition of the body when we first breached the locked door of the study. I recalled aloud the rigid stiffness of the limbs and the deep, plum-coloured pooling of lividity along the victor's back and shoulders. The police surgeon, a well-meaning but utterly conventional official, had confidently estimated the time of death at shortly before midnight based upon the victim's supposedly final piece of correspondence. Yet, I pointed out to Holmes, the physiological evidence flatly contradicted such a late hour. The rigour was far too advanced, the settling of the blood too complete and fixed in the tissues. I admitted my own lingering confusion regarding how the partner could possess an airtight alibi, witnessed by 3 respectable gentlemen at his club for the entirety of the early evening, if the murder had actually occurred precisely then. Holmes expelled a thick, fragrant plume of smoke toward the plastered ceiling, watching it curl and dissipate. He told me my medical instincts were entirely correct, though I had temporarily failed to account for the highly artificial environment of the study itself. He asked me, his voice sharp and probing, to carefully recall the ambient temperature of the room when Inspector Lestrade finally forced the heavy oak door from its brass hinges. I closed my eyes and cast my memory back to that grim, claustrophobic scene. The heat had been physically oppressive, striking us like a physical blow when the door gave way. The fire in the deep iron grate had been piled perilously high with rich Welsh coal. It was burning with a ferocious, consuming intensity long after the rest of the vast manor house had surrendered to the bitter chill of the night. I realized his meaning instantly, the medical logic clicking perfectly into place. I spoke my deduction aloud. The excessive heat would undoubtedly accelerate the chemical onset of rigor mortis and hasten the biological processes of decay. A human body kept in a sealed room resembling a blast furnace would closely mimic a corpse that had been dead for a significantly longer period in normal conditions. The partner had not struck the fatal blow at midnight, nor anywhere near it. He had killed his victim hours earlier, shortly after dusk, when the servants were dismissed and the house was entirely empty. He had then systematically built up the fire to an unnatural, suffocating blaze. Finally, he had locked the door from the outside, utilizing a pair of slender needle-nosed pliers to turn the key from the hallway before departing for his club to cement his alibi. Holmes gave a short, sharp nod, a glint of genuine approval shining in his steely eyes. He confirmed that the manipulated timeline was the very foundation of the deceit. The partner required the police to believe the victim had survived long into the night. But Holmes noted that the true stroke of twisted genius, the illusion that elevated this sordid crime from a mere brutal killing to a theatrical masterpiece, lay in the sealed envelope we had found clutched so tightly in the dead man's stiffened fingers, the letter sealed with tomorrow's wax. I freely admitted that this particular detail still baffled my understanding entirely. The postmark stamped upon the envelope was irrefutable in its clarity. It bore the date of the following morning, stamped heavily and cleanly in the black ink of the official sorting office. Furthermore, the wax itself was the precise, unmistakable pale green hue unique to Lord Harrington's private stationery stock, and it bore the intricate crest of his personal signet ring. Holmes moved gracefully from the mantelpiece and began to pace slowly across the faded pattern of the Persian rug. He stated flatly that the postmark and the wax were the very elements designed specifically to blind the unimaginative eyes of Lestrade. The inspector saw a letter ostensibly sent tomorrow and immediately assumed the man must have died tomorrow. But Holmes had examined the wax closely under his powerful magnifying lens while the police were busy measuring footprints. He abruptly stopped pacing and asked me what specific odor I detected when I first bent over the body to pronounce life extinct. I searched my memory of the sensory details of the room. I recalled the heavy metallic scent of spilled blood soaking into the carpet, the dry dust of the heavy velvet curtains, and another scent beneath it all, a faint, acrid odor remarkably similar to burned sugar or scorched pine. Holmes explained that the pale green wax utilized exclusively by Lord Harrington was a rare, expensive mixture imported from a boutique in Paris, containing an unusually high proportion of natural pine resin. When melted properly and carefully over the steady low flame of a spirit lamp, it softens gently and emits a pleasant, arboreal fragrance. However, the wax deposited upon the fatal letter was severely scorched. The outer edges of the seal were brittle, discolored, and speckled with microscopic black flecks of soot. The partner had stolen a single stick of Harrington's wax during a previous, seemingly innocent visit to the Noble Mains estate, fully intending to use it later to frame him. But on the night of the murder, rushed by the ticking clock and lacking a proper spirit lamp in the study, the killer had callously melted the stolen wax directly over the roaring coal fire he had just built to disguise the time of death. The intense, dirty heat of the coal had scorched the resin, leaving the invisible signature of his haste. I pressed him eagerly on the matter of the signet impression and the impossible future postmark. Holmes revealed that the seal upon the letter was never made with Lord Harrington's actual ring. The partner was entirely too cautious to attempt stealing a piece of jewellery the nobleman wore daily. Instead, the partner had taken a meticulous wax impression of the seal from an old piece of routine business correspondence many weeks prior. He had then journeyed into the darkest slums of Southwark, paying a disreputable blind engraver an exorbitant sum to fashion a crude but passable brass duplicate from the impression. As for the postmark, Holmes continued, his voice dropping to a low, intense register. It was merely a matter of simple railway logistics and bold opportunism. The partner knew intimately that the midnight mail train passing through the local village station collected canvas mailbags directly from a suspended platform hook without stopping. The mechanical date wheel on the postal sorting carriage's stamping machine is routinely rolled forward to the next calendar day, precisely at 11 minutes before midnight, to account accurately for the morning delivery schedule in London. By slipping the forged, pre-sealed letter into the unattended canvas bag, waiting on the dark rain-swept platform during the brief window he supposedly stepped out of the club for a solitary cigar, the partner absolutely ensured it received the official stamp of the future date. The physical mechanism of the deceit was now brutally clear to me, but the underlying motive still required final illumination. I asked Holmes why the partner had gone to such elaborate, perilous lengths to utterly destroy Lord Harrington, rather than simply fleeing the country. Holmes paused by the window, pulling back the curtain slightly to peer out into the gloomy gaslit street below. He explained that the motive was the oldest and most corrosive poison in the world: greed, compounded by desperate terror. The partner had been systematically bleeding the firm's commercial accounts dry for 3 long years. He was a man consumed by expensive hidden vices, gambling vast sums on highly speculative foreign shipping ventures that routinely sank beneath the waves. When the victim finally noticed the glaring discrepancies in the quarterly ledgers on the afternoon of the murder, the partner knew total financial and social ruin was entirely imminent. He had to violently silence his associate, Holmes reasoned, but a simple, unexplained murder would inevitably invite independent auditors to thoroughly examine the financial books. Therefore, the partner had spent the preceding months carefully, obsessively altering the secondary ledgers, employing a masterful forgery of handwriting to make it appear that the embezzled thousands were being quietly routed into dummy accounts secretly controlled by Lord Harrington. The forged letter, seemingly written by the victim in his final moments, was crafted as a desperate, accusatory plea confronting Harrington about the theft of the funds. By leaving it securely in the dead man's hand, the partner aimed to direct the full, crushing weight of Scotland Yard entirely toward the innocent nobleman. Harrington would be ruined, arrested for murder and massive fraud, while the partner would step forward into the light as the grieving, innocent survivor, legally liquidating the remaining company assets and vanishing to the continent, a wealthy man. A heavy silence descended upon our sitting room as the sheer, calculated malice of the plot settled over me. The architecture of the deceit was indeed magnificent in its dark complexity, yet it had been thoroughly dismantled by the man standing before the fire. I voiced my relief that the partner was safely locked away, and that Lord Harrington would awaken the next morning free from the shadow of the gallows. Holmes did not turn from the window. He dropped the curtain, his shoulders rigid beneath his dressing gown. He stated quietly that the partner would indeed face the hangman for his actions tonight, but his voice lacked the customary satisfaction of a closed case. He walked slowly back to the table and picked up a small, leather-bound book we had confiscated from the partner's coat pocket. It was the private ledger, the true accounting of the stolen funds. He opened it to the final page and placed his long, pale finger upon a line of cramped, hurried script. He pointed out that the sums embezzled over 3 years amounted to nearly £80,000. Yet the disastrous shipping ventures and the gambling debts, even at their most extravagant estimates, accounted for barely half of that vast fortune. The partner lived frugally, hoarding his wealth. Holmes looked up from the book, his grey eyes suddenly dark with a profound, unsettling apprehension. He noted a recurring massive expenditure recorded on the first of every month, paid entirely in cash to a nameless address in Limehouse. The partner was a murderer and a thief, Holmes murmured, but he was not the architect of his own ruin. He was a terrified man, bleeding his own company dry to satisfy a master he dared not name. And that master, currently holding £40,000 and the absolute silence of the grave, is still walking the streets of London tonight. Chapter 10. The W-length of Tomorrow. The air in Arthur Pendleton's study had grown thick and entirely unbreathable, suffused with the scent of old paper, cold ash, and the sharp, unmistakable odour of human desperation. Pendleton sat across from us in a deeply tufted armchair, though he appeared entirely unsupported by it. To my medical eye he was a man teetering on the precipice of a severe physical collapse. His pulse, visible at the carotid artery beneath his wilted collar, beat with a frantic avian flutter. His skin was the colour of old parchment, damp with the cold sweat that gathered at his temples, and his hands trembled violently where they rested against his knees. The facade of the prosperous, unshakable city merchant had crumbled away, leaving only a hollow, terrified shell. Holmes stood near the hearth, leaning his shoulder against the marble mantelpiece. He possessed the stillness of a hunting bird that had just struck its prey. He held in his right hand the very object that had unravelled the mystery, the scrap of the forged letter, still bearing the distinctive, futuristic crest pressed into the scarlet wax. He turned it slowly, the firelight catching the wax, making it gleam like a droplet of fresh blood. "You have the truth of it now, Mr. Holmes," Pendleton said, his voice a dry, rasping whisper. "I imagine you will call for the police. I only ask for a moment to write a note to my daughter." "Lestrade is already on his way," Holmes replied, his tone devoid of either triumph or malice. He will be here in a matter of minutes. But the Yard is concerned only with the mechanics of your fraud and the unfortunate demise of your partner. I am concerned with the catalyst. A man of your meticulous, cowardly nature does not suddenly embrace forgery, extortion, and violence without a lever being applied. What was the lever, Pendleton? Pendleton closed his eyes, and a single tear escaped, tracking through the dust and sweat on his cheek. Clara, he whispered. My Clara. I leaned forward in my chair. I had met Clara Pendleton briefly during our initial inquiries at the country estate. She was a quiet, delicate girl of 19, possessing a melancholy beauty and a manner that suggested life lived entirely under the shadow of overbearing men. I could scarcely connect that fragile creature with the dark business of extortion and murder. The syndicate, Holmes stated. It was not a question. Pendleton nodded slowly. The men operating out of the warehouses in Rotherhithe. Clara, foolish, trusting Clara, had become entangled with a man named Silas Vane. She thought him a gentleman. He was a predator. He induced her to sign promissory notes, manipulated her into placing her own name on debts accrued at the gaming tables. When the debts mounted to an impossible sum, Vane vanished, leaving the syndicate holding paper that bore my daughter's signature. They came to me. They did not ask for money, Mr. Holmes. They demanded a sum that would have required the liquidation of everything I owned, and even then it would not have sufficed. They told me that if I did not pay, Clara would be taken to the continent. I knew what that meant. I knew the horrors they intended for her. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. As a soldier, I had seen the brutalities men were capable of inflicting upon one another on the battlefield, but the calculated, systematic destruction of a young woman's life for profit struck me as a far deeper evil. I looked at Pendleton, and the disgust I had felt for the man only moments before began to curdle into a grim, uncomfortable pity. He was a murderer and a thief, but he was also a father drowning in a desperate sea. And so you concocted the scheme with the letter, I said, keeping my voice low. You needed the capital from your partner's trust, and you needed it immediately. The futuristic wax seal, the backdated postmark, it was all designed to release the funds before the syndicate's deadline. It was the only way, Pendleton sobbed, burying his face in his trembling hands. My partner would never have agreed to ruin the firm to save my daughter. He cared only for the ledger. I had to bypass him. When he discovered the forgery, when he threatened to expose me to the bank and to the authorities, we struggled. He struck his head against the iron safe. It was an accident, Dr. Watson. I swear it upon my soul. But once he was dead, the path was clear. I sealed the letter, I arranged the body, and I waited for the funds to clear. The wax was supposed to be a guarantee of tomorrow, a tomorrow where Clara was safe. Holmes stepped away from the mantelpiece and walked slowly to the centre of the room. He looked down at the broken man. You bought tomorrow with the blood of today, Mr. Pendleton. It is a transaction that the universe rarely allows to stand. They will kill her, Pendleton cried out, looking up with wild, bloodshot eyes. When they learn I am arrested, when the funds do not arrive, the Rothy men will take her. I beg of you, Mr. Holmes, let me arrange the payment. Let me save her, and then I will gladly walk to the gallows. Holmes withdrew his silver pocket watch, snapping the case open with a sharp click that seemed to echo in the quiet room. You insult my intelligence and you underestimate my methods, he said coldly. Did you truly believe I would unravel your sordid little conspiracy and leave the root cause unaddressed? I abhor untidy endings, Pendleton. Pendleton stared at him, uncomprehending. 3 hours ago, Holmes continued, slipping the watch back into his waistcoat, before I confronted you in this room, I sent a telegram to Scotland Yard and another to a certain inspector of my acquaintance who concerns himself with the organised vice of the East End. While we've been having this edifying conversation, a raid has been executed upon the Rotherhithe warehouses. Silas Vane and his associates are presently occupying holding cells. The promissory notes bearing your daughter's signature have been recovered and I assure you, will conveniently burn in a hearth at Baker Street. Your daughter is currently sitting in the parlour of Mrs. Might, Hudson, drinking heavily sugared tea under the watchful eye of a very capable former sergeant of the Marines. The change that came over Pendleton was instantaneous and profound. The breath rushed out of him in a long, ragged sigh, and the tension that had held his frame rigid completely dissolved. He slipped from the chair, falling to his knees upon the Persian rug. He did not attempt to touch Holmes, but he bowed his head, weeping with a wretched, uninhibited relief. "Thank you," he wept. "May God bless you, Mr. Holmes." "Do not thank me," Holmes replied, turning his back on the man. "I acted for the girl's sake, not yours. You have committed a grave crime, and you must face the machinery of the law. I have merely ensured that the innocent do not fall beneath the wheels alongside you." The heavy tread of boots upon the stairs announced the arrival of the authorities. The door opened to reveal Inspector Lestrade flanked by two uniformed constables. The inspector looked from the weeping man on the floor to Holmes, his sharp, rat-like face breaking into a satisfied smirk. The arrest was a mechanical, dreary affair. Pendleton offered no resistance. He held out his wrists for the irons with the eerie calm of a man who has already departed this world. As they led him away, he did not look back. Our journey back to Baker Street was undertaken in a profound and contemplative silence. The London sky had opened, releasing a steady, freezing rain that drummed relentlessly against the roof of our hansom cab. The streets were slick and black, reflecting the yellow halos of the gas lamps. The dampness seeped into the heavy wool of my overcoat, carrying with it the smell of the river and the coal smoke that forever blanketed the city. I sat watching the raindrops trace jagged paths across the glass, my mind turning over the tragic arithmetic of the morning. When we finally reached our quarters, the fire had been built up by Mrs. Hudson, and the room was blissfully warm. Clara Pendleton had already been taken to the home of a respectable aunt in Surrey, her immediate future secured, though the shadow of her father's impending trial would undoubtedly darken her days. Holmes shed his damp coat and threw himself into his velvet armchair. He reached immediately for his pipe, packing it with the strong, pungent shag tobacco he favoured from the Persian slipper by the hearth. He lit it, drawing deeply, and a thick blue cloud soon enveloped his head. I poured myself a measure of brandy from the crystal decanter on the sideboard, the glass clinking softly in the quiet room. I took a seat opposite him, allowing the fiery liquid to chase the damp chill from my bones. "It is a peculiar thing, Holmes," I began, breaking the long silence, "to look upon a man who is both a monster and a martyr. He shattered every moral law, yet his motive was anchored in the purest of human instincts. It leaves a bitter taste in the mouth. I find myself wondering where the scales of justice truly balance in a matter such as this." Holmes exhaled a long plume of smoke, watching it coil toward the ceiling. "The scales of the law are rigid, Watson. They measure only actions, not the depths of the human heart, and perhaps it is better so. If we allowed motive to excuse murder, civilization would collapse into a bloody chaos of personal justifications. Pendleton chose to play God with time and life. He forged a seal of tomorrow to mask a sin of today. But time cannot be cheated. He believed he was trapped, I noted. He believed fate had forced his hand. "Fatalism is the philosophy of the weak," Holmes replied, his eyes narrowing. "Pendleton was not destroyed by fate. He was destroyed by a sequence of logical consequences born from his own cowardice. He allowed his daughter to be manipulated. He chose to forge the latter. He chose to strike his partner. He tried to outrun the consequences of his actions by projecting a false reality into the future. That is the true tragedy, Watson. Men spend their lives dreading the future or attempting to control it, forgetting that tomorrow is built entirely upon the foundation of the choices they make today. The wax he used was merely a symbol of his arrogance. He thought he could seal tomorrow, but tomorrow always arrives, and it always breaks the seal. I fell silent, recognizing the unyielding truth in my friend's words. Holmes was a creature of the present, of the tangible, observable fact. He had no patience for men who lived in the illusions of what might be. Yet, as I sat there listening to the rain beat against our windows, I could not help but feel a profound sorrow for the frailties of the human condition. We are all, in our own ways, desperate to protect the things we love, and the line between salvation and damnation is sometimes terrifyingly thin. The case was closed. Arthur Pendleton would face the assizes, and the gallows surely awaited him. The syndicate men would serve their time in the brutal confines of Dartmoor. Clara Pendleton would live, carrying the heavy burden of the life that was traded for hers. I remained at my desk long after Holmes had retired to his room, the house silent save for the ticking of the clock in the hall. In the centre of my blotter lay the solitary piece of physical evidence Holmes had permitted me to keep. It was a single, broken shard of the scarlet wax, still bearing the partial impression of a date that had not yet come to pass. I reached out and touched it, feeling the cold, hard reality of the material. It was just wax, inert and meaningless, yet it held within it the terrible weight of tomorrow, a silent monument to the enduring folly of men who try to purchase the future with the sins of the present.